Well, looks like I'm a bit late for the year-end recap again. Oh well, still better time than last year's at least. 2022. What a chaotic yet ultimately boring year. I swear, 2020 reset the world's expectations for any future years because of how eventful in the worst ways it was. As soon as anything bad happens, we get flashbacks of that cursed year. Well, that would be the case if you continued to struggle coping with how life ain't as simple as you once had it. Regardless, there's still valid trauma connected to that year for many which remains unresolved. But while 2021 felt like the lingering misery of retaining its grip with almost nothing happening good or bad to distract from it, 2022 seems like the true healing year in my eyes. It was still somewhat bleak and uneventful like the previous, though there was at least some sense of life. You could directly connect this to COVID-19's dominance shrinking significantly after the winter. The restrictions had calmed, and news about it looked to be less dire than before. The virus does still remain active, with a new Omicron subvariant sparking health concerns once again, though I think we finally accepted the unfortunate truth that COVID is just going to be a regular occurrence from here on out. Probably for the best we've learned this, since the overhype in its peak years tanked the mental health of millions, and we're well past the point of actually containing the virus. At least with the treatments we have available now, even with the skepticism towards some, the threat has been greatly reduced. And with the pandemic basically being over by definition, one of the biggest trends of 2021 had faced a strong collapse. Last year, I did mention how cryptocurrency, NFTs, and most other related experiments under the Web3 umbrella were slowly becoming less relevant to the public at large. After all, what positive purpose did they serve to the average Joe or Jane? Besides a short-term sense of belonging for investing, not much of anything. Whatever value those crypto coins or JPEG japes could have had didn't stick. Not only was the market oversaturated, but the infrastructure just wasn't built to handle that type of business. Holes in their security were reported on the regular, and them being volatile as a whole severely harmed their prospects. You'd be gambling to a losing game nearly every time. That was unless you were committing a crime by laundering money from it. And speaking of money laundering, whatever optimism it did have higher up was destroyed when the crypto exchanging mogul FTX, more specifically its CEO Samuel Bankman-Fried, was put under serious scrutiny for exactly that, with parts of it directly relating to the Russian-Ukraine war effort. The war itself obviously left a bloody mark over the year as well, but I won't discuss it here since I'm really not qualified to weigh my thoughts on it beyond the well-worn virtue of war bad. Anyways, with the crypto economy already running dry, not helped by rapid inflation and economic instability, things grew ugly real quick. FTX would file for bankruptcy, and among claims of conspiracy and fraud, this reasonably pissed off the many investors who supported them. While I still personally think that their investments were absurd, they do at least deserve some form of financial compensation. Because of this, its CEO remains under investigation and could face life imprisonment if ruled guilty. So yeah, I think we were right for thinking much of the crypto cringe was a worthless fad more than anything. What value could you even objectively apply to intangible collector items if there's no means of protecting them? Just collect stuff you can actually interact with like trading cards or Hot Wheels. Fucking Pogs would actually be a greater investment for dated meme's sake. However, while crypto may have lost its stock in more ways than one, the tech world continues to grace us with more controversial innovations, with 2022's being the sheer dominance of AI-generated media. Similarly to the crypto explosion, AI text prompt services saw a spike in popularity for more than just the nerds. It was also technology which had seen major developments in previous years that made its way to the masses. How many synthesized SpongeBob voice memes and AI text hack highlights did you see in the past few years? However, unlike crypto, this stuff was generally more accessible and often intended to be solely for entertainment uses. Plus, there was little fear of huge risks being taken compared to the Bored Ape machine, at least financially. Take note that I said there were still risks to partaking in that activity, more so related to your reputation as a creative. This is most evident with the trend of AI image generation and, yes, AI art. This was initially viewed as little more than a novelty to mess around with, and see what ridiculous results would come from equally ridiculous prompts. You weren't using them to get some carefully crafted masterpiece. Most likely you just wanted to have a laugh at the odd imagery salad that was generated. No shortage of great shitposts in the first half of 2022 were created through those means. However, as more robust and accurate generators got developed, plenty saw serious potential in this technology. To the shock of no one, the exact tech bro drones who idolized the Bored Ape Yacht Club grew interested. After all, they eat up anything which satisfies their computing fetish. But hey, so what if the trend has been co-opted by fringe tech freaks? That alone shouldn't be enough to doom whatever positive hype those tools may have had, right? You'd be totally right for thinking this if it weren't for the dubious methods of sourcing many of these high-budget projects we're using. Very much like the NFT phenomenon previously, many online artists claim that these tools are using their creations to feed their reference datasets, Stable Diffusion in particular being the most targeted example of these since it's the root for many of the most advanced generators on the market. Since they appear to be using the works of artists without their permission, they've argued these programs are infringing their intellectual property rights by having their works as reference data. Normally in these scenarios, I'd be rallying wholesale against the mere concept of automated image production, animation, especially so for this purpose. The defenses I've seen in favor of it sure don't help matters, when most of them make weak excuses regarding accessibility and precious time. Insulting hardworking artists is not a wise move to gain acceptance. However, while I'm personally not a fan of the fad, I do feel like the overhype has been unjustified, even outright hysterical at times. There's plenty of things I do concede on with other artists towards this, like the legally gray nature of sourcing and automation of a medium driven by artistic vision stripping art of its soul. Robots should not replace such a symbol of personality in major media. Even then, part of me feels like the paranoia has led to a toxic environment for the art community at large, and does nothing to earn respect from the less creatively inclined. My main problem is that it treats the tech like a pure act of evil that must be torn apart, with little room for debate. I don't want to call it gatekeeping since it's not exactly unwarranted in this case, but I could definitely call some of this entitlement on the artist's behalf. Since algorithms and institutions already don't favor them fairly, much of those vocal against AI art feel they demand better treatment and greater attention. It's the second part of it which makes it really hard to actually side with them, unfortunately. Look, I'm sorry if your work hasn't been favored by the luck-based social media algorithms, but I can't in good conscience say you have an inherent right to more audience impressions. On top of that, I also feel that the concerns regarding stolen work are also hyperbolic. Is it questionable that these AIs are using data feeds containing many artists' work without any form of license? Absolutely yes. However, should you be panicking at the mere thought of your stuff being part of any of these datasets? Probably not, or at least not to the extent some are. There's no way of guaranteeing if your stuff will ever truly be ripped off for an image prompt, since the datasets are massive and likely pulled from multiple sources at once. Why else are most specific details so wonky in AI-generated art? This isn't to defend the practice by any means, but it's not a great thing to stress about. Bad enough that I get vibes which suggest that they think an art style is sacred intellectual property like the drawings are, and entitled to the same protections, which they aren't for the record. You cannot, in good faith, claim ownership on an art style, unless you want to stifle creativity in the same way the usual corporate lobbyists do. If so,
Fuck you.
how many royalties would you owe to the artists who served as an inspiration for your own style if that was the case? Most likely enough to not actually be able to pay them all back. We already have issues exactly like this in the music industry, so we shouldn't have that spread to a much broader medium. It's simply not a good precedent for a community which prides itself on personal creative license. And lastly, there's the prospect of AI art being designed to eliminate the jobs of many in the industry. While I've said before that as an artist, I wouldn't want computers to take away such a valuable job, there comes a point where they're viewing the situation from the worst possible outcome. In all fairness, some fields like concept art and background designers may have rational concerns for their job security to be lost. After all, they're some of the few things that AI generation thus far has shown to be halfway competent at mimicking. Though for many other positions which require a much greater sense of accuracy, such as character design, it might not be worth fearing just yet. It would likely take years before AI is even capable of handling that level of complexity, and even then it'd still be a mixed bag. So while the concerns may vary depending on what roles you play, I wouldn't let them overwhelm you to the point of losing all motivation. Hopelessness makes the process of elimination much faster. For all we know, this could just be seen as yet another fad whose relevance is dependent on how much it can be milked, just like crypto was. AI-generated video and writing show greater signs of shaping the future of those industries compared to more directly artistic mediums. It'll no doubt be abused by big corpos and scammers, but what can you really do about that? Since very few art styles can even be replicated decently by those AIs, the investment might not last. At best, it might just serve as assistance for future projects. The only real thing I can speak confidently against are platforms forcing our work into those datasets and having to opt out manually, like what DeviantArt and Adobe have done. ArtStation has also been criticized for censoring anti-AI protest images. Overall, unless development grows so rapidly that companies start integrating it en masse, we shouldn't let this news affect us like this. The industry itself is already under pressure due to the unauthorized use of source material, and AI works are often unable to be registered for copyright. Stable Diffusion is also being sued, so we'll have to see how that turns out. Honestly, all I ask from artists is to stop spamming that one anti-AI art image. It's that kind of performative political plastering that makes artists more of a punchline than they already are, and are very undeserving of. Speaking of loud preaching from the artistically minded, there's been a lot of this towards the latest Warner Bros. Discovery merger. Say anything you will about the ridiculous shit that came out of this incompetent transfer of power, I've said my piece when the madness started. Still, this combined with the Oscars fiasco which began the year has really disconnected me from the animation alarmists which represent a large percentage of Toonhead influencers, especially over on Twitter. There were other things that grew this disconnect, but I think you can guess what the main ones are, and some of those will be discussed later in this video. Admittedly, 2022 was a really bad year in terms of animation news. Hell, it was bad for major media in general. Tons of projects look to have been axed either due to corporate restructure or declining faith in the economy. The streaming heights of the pandemic era have officially come to an end, and companies are now facing huge losses on their investments in the aftermath. And while this has been often warped into a political firestorm regarding diversity of race, sex, and gender in pop culture, both in favor and against, the fact a lot of animated projects were singled out made the cartoon crowd think the entertainment industry was conspiring against the medium. During During this time, a lot of the community parroted the mindset that animation is for everyone. And I mean, yeah, no Dippin' Dots, Donatello. Very few would argue against that, even higher up in film. I know there's still the out-of-touch executives who view everything from a soulless monetary lens, but even so, why the need to be so insecure about how outsiders treat animated media? Just watch them make the stuff you enjoy without having those worries cloud your headspace. It's not difficult. It may suck that studios aren't treating animated media the best, though it's again not worth sounding entitled over. I mentioned all this on the subject of WBD since to me, other than the Batgirl tax write-off, that's practically all that people were complaining about with the merger. And it's less that they were complaining at all that was the problem, since I didn't necessarily disagree with all of it, more that it never seemed to stop whenever HBO Max made cuts to their streaming lineup. It was also a trend for hashtags against the new CEO, David Zaslav, to be spread around. The most aggressive of which was one demanding he be fired. On its own, it was just a stupid reactionary trend which gave a platform to some of the whiniest of entertainment consumers. Warner was in massive debt before the merger, and many of their write-offs were intended to unload much of it. I guess movies are more important than managing finances during a looming recession. No matter how reasonable the complaints were otherwise, or if I agreed with any of them, I just got burnt out hearing about it practically non-stop. Some of course took the chance to express their sadistic wishes against Zaslav. Pals of mine have mocked this trend with the phrase "snipe David Zaslav," which sadly isn't far removed from how some of these whiners probably felt inside. The man's simply a clueless CEO, not like that's anything new in the entertainment industry. Just move on already. And if they aren't directing their bile at someone who's at least influential enough to be worth crapping on, you have the animation army rebelling against other dead horses to spread a message about media illiteracy. Yeah, we gotta talk about the big thing from 2022, which got the Cartoon Clan and other trend hoppers to lose their marbles for a couple months. I was not immune either, since I also discussed this exact thing during its peak. I have already made a video where I discussed this exact subject, so I'll only describe this very briefly. To sum the controversy up, Jaded Has-Been Cartoon Critic gives his thoughts on the Canadian Red Panda movie, makes some nonsensical or bad-faith criticisms against it, the most notable of which being about how an American tragedy more than 6 months before the film's setting conflicts with his perception of what the period was like culturally. The clip blew up on Twitter, the reviewer threw a hissy fit overnight, and its impact opened the floodgates for a film that was already under fire from conservative moralists weeks earlier. As a result, the movie saw a prolonged period of relevance that was so undeserved, not even the other attempts at manufactured Disney outrage could stick around after a week. It also did a great job at reviving 9/11 jokes. Awesome! To say this was a direct byproduct of the unavoidable culture war would be indisputable. In that moment, it felt like all the most obnoxious voices regardless of opinion or political leaning had been put under a supernova of a spotlight for the entire second half of April and most of May. A majority of which had no business engaging in such a flammable environment for dishonesty and half-baked activism. It was easily the most obnoxious example of that this year, even with some serious competition. Should say a lot when more idiotic controversies on related trivial garbage kept appearing every other week, it felt like. Seems like the tech phobes were right after all. Social media really was the catalyst for societal collapse. It was actually during this period of chaos, though, that I actually found a strange sense of solace with that infamous reviewer's content. That sounds like blasphemy to say these days, since Mr. Ender is symbolized as the primary factor in why online media criticism has become more about spectacle and politically influenced grift than genuine insight. And while that impression may remain true for some of his worst errors, I think that's an unfair shadow to cast on him in the present, even with all his fuck-ups. It's not even that I really like him as a critic, since to this day I still find his usual to be very middle of the road, and his forced aggressive posturing and trauma dumping detract from the experience in his most negative videos. When he doesn't sound like a huge party pooper though, I feel he offers a lot of compelling insight towards a myriad of subjects, especially on topics which are often misunderstood by the typical critic demographic. Videos like his recent one on Phoebe and her unicorn shelving prove he has the intellectual chops many have underestimated. It's not without its shortcomings and all, but I can't be genuinely mad at the guy. If anything, I much admire his honesty. Maybe it would be less favorable of him if most of his detractors actually bothered to deconstruct the statements they consider awful or dangerous, and not retread the same ground from years past. Would also help if they did resort to blatant misinformation themselves. For all his issues, I think we need more critics like him with more of a bite. So many recent critics I feel are either playing it way too safe with their takes so they aren't mutilated by the cancel-happy mobs, or putting all their negative energy in the wrong places. Ironically, one of the original criticisms against Enter being his moralizing of fictional media has become the socially accepted way to defend any bitchy vents towards stuff he disliked. It's one thing to not vibe well with rudeness or immorality in fiction, but as a whole other level to project your own negative life experiences onto it and let that dictate how others should see those works. That is a problem I have with modern media analysis that is often rejected. While he was once part of that problem, I just wish that people stopped treating Enter and others like him as a threat to media discourse when they enabled the environment which led to the problem in the first place. Then again, that can't be hard to look past when one of Enter's worst takes of the year for me wasn't actually the 9/11 thing, but the promotion of a sleazy billionaire grifter acquiring Twitter just to own the libs or whatever the fuck. Yeah, that still kind of frustrates me even now. And while we did apologize for his behavior recently, it was emblematic of the horrid spite he had during the initial turning red backlash. More than anything, I think it goes to show how the only true motivation to get Musk in charge was a lame attempt at partisan revenge disguised as promotion of free speech. This may sound like an odd topical segue, but screw it, that's the transition I'm going with. Like the rest of what's been discussed here, this did get a share of overreactions, but unlike the rest, I'm more confident to side with the detractors on this one. Not necessarily for his business decisions, although those are shaky at best. It's more about how he's weaponizing populist agenda to satisfy his own ego. One thing that's been known for years is that Musk is a huge cult of personality, especially in the tech community and the faux conservative grift. The kind of guy who promises all sorts of human evolution through tech, but from a hyper-libertarian lens which is directly opposed to the solutions wanted by the majority. In other words, he's a textbook definition of a Reddit centrist. Is NASA spending too much time dinking around on worthless cosmic science? Let's make our own private space force and try to colonize Mars. Want the high-speed rail network in the United States? Meh. How about localized Tesla tunnels that are way less convenient instead? Want to have the luxury of autonomous driving? How about we make it super duper easy for you to get severely injured if not die from it? And if that does happen to you, you're responsible for it. You signed that ULO which gave away your right to sue us. Most recently though, he's played the same game other reactionary social media platforms like Parler, BitChute, and Gab have played in the past by promising better protections for free speech and less political discrimination. At least that's what they claim. You don't need me to say this is all just worthless gesturing to appease the free speech absolutist crowd, which thinks there should be zero boundaries as to what they can and cannot say, no matter how hateful or violent their words actually are. And it's very obvious that this is insincere as all hell when everyone who claims to follow that mantra are absolute hypocrites the moment they see stuff which upsets them. After all, these are the same exact people who claim that diversity, which they refer to as wokeness, and quote, Generation Snowflake, unquote, are destroying the Western world, conflating past tradition with fundamentalist values. It's a mindset they've kept strong since the mid-2010s when social justice causes began reaching wider audiences and gained more support than ever before. While there were bad apples in those movements, and mainstream media did more harm than good in this regard, I think it's obvious why they're so broad about what the umbrella label of woke represents. Since the far-right co-opted similar populist rhetoric for their campaigns, with fellow cult leader / former President Donald Trump being the face of this counterculture to many, it's been real hard to see this as more than a palatable way to be bigoted with minimal thought. It became so accepted that many started saying the quiet parts out loud, and tons of blatantly hateful state laws have been introduced, especially against trans people. And while this epidemic was by no means at its worst in 2022, Elon latching onto it might be the most cynical attempt at cashing in on that audience since Trump played this trick. Unlike the Orange Man though, El Meatwad lacks any true charisma. Musk himself was already under a lot of scrutiny regarding the ethics of his businesses even prior to the Twitter acquisition, so him trying to play this bullshit game on the easily manipulated was not surprising, but still disgusting on all accounts. After sinking $44 billion into it after being forced to buy it, guess what that's led to? Well, beyond losing pretty much all sense of public trust, he now has the crowning achievement of losing a record $200 billion. And while this may be more related to Tesla's stock plummeting at the time, I can only see that as karma for trying to shift the narrative on Twitter, on top of releasing grossly unsafe self-driving features on Tesla cars. But even if the Muskrat's trust with the public has gone sour, he still has enough diehard bots, supporters to fuel his desires. And since he does remain considerably wealthy, that of course means he's got influence to prop up other fringe scumbags like him. I'm more frustrated by the fact his whole plan to trick the masses actually worked out due to his deified status among his followers. And while many of his victims have grown to regret his decisions after the shit came crumbling down, the damage that's been done can't really be healed. They supported his foolish efforts, and now everyone is paying the price for his incompetence. Say anything you will about the Warner Bros. Discovery blunder, but all that really impacted was an entertainment industry already in disarray and not a huge deal unless you worked there. With Twitter, not only was a majority of their staff laid off, but the power structure appears to have grown more like a dictatorship than it was before, which is funny, because I've heard a lot of people championing this were saying that was exactly what the problem was before. Not sure how you can call what Twitter is now better, especially when they continue engaging in obvious censorship. Part of me feels it was a deliberate attempt to tank the platform. While Twitter was already trashy in the past, this is not the way it should end. Yet because I'm a total masochist and have a halfway tolerable experience there, I haven't bothered leaving. I did say I was going to if Musk did buy it out, but when have I been known for sticking to my own word? I was much closer to leaving DeviantArt again this year because of their AI leeching than I was to shuttering the Bird app. At worst, I've been slightly less active on there, which in all honesty was a resolution I should have made long before the buyout. In conclusion, Musk is a fraud and a troubling figure to have lead an influential platform, especially given the chaos unfolding. Phew. Well, considering how heated that segment was, I think I should express more about how my year went on a personal level. I must admit I've got little to say about that since it was more or less a repeat of 2021 events-wise. However, unlike that year, my mental state was nowhere near as grim. Even then, my motivation continued to remain in limbo for long periods of time, which I've just come to accept as normal unfortunately. Though besides a slow summer, I think my productivity was on par with 2021's on whole. I'll discuss art in videos like I've done for these past year-end recaps, but before that, I should explain why 2022 felt less stressful to me. If you haven't picked up on how I've handled much of the subject so far, I didn't react quite as negatively as I previously have for the most part. Besides the bit about the elongated muskrat, this video hasn't been as dramatic as much of my others towards similar matters. While I've still got some bitter tendencies deep inside, and I do apologize if my attitude can be overbearing, I feel like I've gained better control of those feelings, at least for now. Life's way too short to keep wasting time moping with no plans to solve your issues in life. I also don't want to spread such negative vibes onto my audience since it's not what I'd like to be known for. That's not to say I won't have my grumpy moments here and there, but I'd rather control and minimize them since those often tend to be the times where I exaggerate and get things wrong most. Venting can sometimes do the opposite of helping. Plus, I've just grown tired of how quick some people are to spin any unpleasant news into a cry for validation. That's happened with the anti-AI crowd, it's happened with Toonheads, it's happened with the Musk stands, and it's obviously happened to me far too often. I thankfully haven't had much to truly release my anger out on lately. Still wish I was more positive, but I feel it's a step in the right direction. Though I must also confess that I desperately need to touch grass, and my insecurities have only halted my progress in that since the pandemic. Only excuse I've got is that I feel I lack the proper guidance. I still want to get on the right path for 2023 to break the cycle, that just requires a lot of effort. Since I've already aired out much of the thoughts that needed releasing about the year, let's get into the art and video recap portion of this video. I will be brief on the artist side of things since it wasn't too different from 2021's output. Similar art ambition, similar productivity. This summer did mark a major lull in my output in this regard. Bad enough that I skipped July and August for my year-end art summary. But on the contrary, October was actually a huge rebound from my productivity. Of the works produced for that month, I'm most proud of the celebration piece I made for my birthday featuring 4 of my goofballs. Newman, why must you spoil the cake again? February and early March were also decently productive on the traditional side of things, which you may recall from my belated 2021 retrospective. Some of those were posted publicly if there were enough interesting doodles to spotlight. Would also help fill in long gaps where I didn't release any polished digital art. Didn't do nearly the same amount of shitposts this year, but this quirky Cosmos one I quite like fits somewhere in the middle. Fan art was minimal as well, but most of them were for 2 French cartoons, one which grew to become a major interest of mine this year. Can't go wrong with a cute Yoshi either. And lastly, the chubby gecko design from last year was finally given the name of Gary this December. Who can truly hate a Gary? Well, unless they're of the glittery kind. Yuck. Overall, it was a solid year, if nothing exceptional. Videos, however, are where things get a lot more interesting. Like last year, only 3 proper videos materialize, but there's plenty to discuss with what was made. I guess unfortunately, 2/3 of this head back to the infamous mystery man who I discussed earlier. If you want any proof on how polarized Enter as a person made me, the first video was more negative towards him, and the other more defensive. There's a lot of nuances which don't make it a night and day situation, though you could easily sense the shift in tune. However, since the negative video came out during the height of this shit show, and that was the viewpoint which got more approval, it's not shocking that performed better. Though I'm not complaining because it actually did help my channel quite a bit. Why do I harp on this? Well, considering the follow-up was made to call out the worst critics of Enter which littered the discourse, it paints the original video in a stark contrast. There have been days where I've regretted making the original Enter video, since I felt like I enabled the exact culture I later spoke against. But oh well, that's just the reality of falling close to the general consensus during its relevance. Besides, I continued to stick by a decent amount of my gripes expressed even if my emotions muddied the presentation, especially with the last part of my response. If you want better executed responses to this exact video to give you extra perspective though, please go watch the videos done by Boonslayer and Movies with Mark. Cause let's be real, even for Enter standards, there were some woefully ignorant takes in that Turning Red video, beyond the obvious one which snowballed. One interesting note about its production was that aside from reactions on Twitter, I made the decision of not watching any other recent responses to him when work on my own began. You might say that choice was a closed-minded direction to take, but I had enough confidence in what I was saying while also recognizing most other early responses would likely just be surface level. I was not wrong at all with my assumption. Dear God, most of the videos were terrible. The follow-up, as I mentioned, was made to voice out frustrations I've had with the types who overhyped Enter's bad takes to represent more about the climate than they really do. Casual bad-mouthing and slander of the guy which did nothing to help him or themselves productively. I can't deny some spite influenced that video too, but I still found it necessary for the sake of bluntness. Especially so in regards to calling out shameless disinformation driven by their own hatred. The fact these lies continue being spread by influential names, including other reviewers today with minimal opposition, poisons the well even more. It wasn't all about that though, since the beginning was dedicated to improving or retracting some of my original points which I thought were flimsy or held up badly. Shows how much the discourse of an overexposed animation reviewer invaded my mind during the year's midpoint. Believe me, I'm as sick of talking about him as you probably are hearing about it. Oh, and speaking of animation reviews, October saw the release of my first attempt at a proper media review with the Pet Alien video. It was nice to finally discuss what I find to be an overlooked slice of wacky French-flavored CGI after half a decade of green guy admiration. It was a labor of love doing that video, and an angle that very few actually take with reviews in such a personal direction. It's a review that I feel only I could have made, since very few would put this much time and effort into analyzing material this obscure. It was great hearing feedback on both the cartoon itself and my style of reviewing in the comments. It's motivated me to continue doing these. Now for the future plans portion of the program. Last year I mentioned that I had another project which was going to function closer to a traditional review, however that will be on a series of unauthorized video games from one of the most infamous knockoff development teams. The signs have been there for over a year, but I still want to build some suspense for those unaware of those games. And in a similar spirit to my Pet Alien review, other shows I've become attached to might also be discussed through videos. That does include the idea of covering miscellaneous Pet Alien stuff, which may double as some added thoughts on the cartoon itself. Might not come this year, but who knows. Oh, and if anyone remembers the ending of my second enter video, I mentioned that I like to do some shorter videos on subjects which give me a decent amount to discuss, but wouldn't feel right being labeled as mainline videos. These may instead end up as a rebrand of my rant series. Beep beep! The proposed title for this is currently Brackets Racket, cause you gotta have a catchy name. My first is likely to be a retooling of an older rant of mine on call-out culture, which desperately needs to be updated, especially because of a very poorly phrased moment that had unfortunate implications. The original has been set to unlisted for this exact reason. I've got other scripts in my backlog which may also become part of this series. I've also been meaning to do a second CD collection video after years of holding the idea off. It gives me a good excuse to express my interest in music, which I seldom have the opportunity to share. Anyways, that wraps up yet another overdue year in review. 2022 was wild, and the new normal truly set in, but it was a year that taught me a lot. 2023 isn't looking so bright, but a lot can change in a couple months. Getting my life back on track is a major personal goal I want to achieve. It may help my drive to create in some way on top of the other benefits. As always, thanks a ton for all of your support over these years, and I'll see you all next time. Snapple. Open. Now.